Black Hollow. The name itself felt heavy, a shroud draped over a forgotten memory. It was a town lost to time, its streets reclaimed by nature, its houses standing empty like hollowed-out eyes staring into oblivion. No one dared to live there anymore, not since the incident. The stories lingered, whispered warnings passed down through generations. Black Hollow was a scar on the landscape, a testament to some unseen terror that refused to die. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, their branches gnarled like skeletal fingers scratching the sky. A perpetual twilight seemed to hang over the town, a palpable sense of dread clinging to the air. Black Hollow was a place where shadows danced in broad daylight and the silence whispered secrets best left buried. The town was a ghost of its former self, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lay dormant beneath its surface. It was a place where the past refused to die, and the present was stained with the echoes of forgotten screams. Alex Munro was a man haunted by ghosts, both literal and figurative. A former journalist, he had seen the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men, but the darkness he carried within himself was far more profound. The loss of his wife and daughter in a tragic accident had left him hollowed out, a shell of the man he once was. He had come to Black Hollow seeking solace, or perhaps a kindred spirit, in the town's desolate beauty. He bought a small, dilapidated Victorian house on the outskirts, hoping to find peace in its isolation, to outrun the memories that clung to him like cobwebs. But the silence of Black Hollow was deceptive, a thin veil over something ancient and evil that stirred beneath the surface. Black Hollow held an eerie allure, a sense of mystery that drew him in like a moth to a flame. He sensed a story here, a story buried deep within the town's haunted history, a story that mirrored the darkness he felt within himself. He just didn't know how deeply he was about to get pulled in. The townspeople were an enigma. Their eyes were empty, their faces etched with a weariness that ran deeper than time. They moved with a strange stillness, like figures in a faded photograph, their voices hushed whispers that seemed to evaporate in the heavy air. They kept to themselves, their gazes sliding away whenever Alex tried to engage them in conversation. He'd tried to talk to them, to glean some insight into the town's history, but they were tight-lipped, their responses evasive and cryptic. They spoke of a curse, of an ancient evil that haunted Black Hollow, of people who had disappeared without a trace. But their words were like smoke, swirling around the edges of truth but never quite revealing it. Their silence spoke volumes. It was a silence born of fear, a fear so deeply ingrained that it had become a part of them. A fear that kept them prisoners in their own homes, their lives shrouded in shadows. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something they weren't telling him, something dark and terrible that they were desperate to keep hidden. Mr. Voss, his next-door neighbour, was an unsettling figure. Tall and gaunt, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through Alex, he exuded an aura of cold detachment. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost predatory, and his voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sent shivers down Alex's spine. Voss rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were cryptic, laced with a sardonic humour that seemed to mock Alex's unease. He spoke of the town's history with a strange familiarity, as if he had been there for centuries, a silent observer to its descent into darkness. There was a darkness in Voss, a coldness that seemed to emanate from his very core. Alex couldn't help but feel that he was hiding something, some terrible secret that he was desperate to keep concealed. Alex tried to convince himself that his unease was just his imagination running wild, fueled by the town's eerie atmosphere and his own haunted past, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with Mr. Voss, something sinister. As the days turned into nights, the silence of Black Hollow grew heavier, punctuated by strange and unsettling occurrences. Shadows seemed to move in the periphery of his vision, vanishing when he turned to face them. He'd hear whispers in the dead of night, disembodied voices that seemed to seep from the very walls of his house. The wind carried the sound of distant screams, carried on the breeze only to be swallowed up by the oppressive silence that descended once more. The scent of decay lingered in the air, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of his throat. He started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, of shadowy figures with glowing red eyes and a darkness that seemed to consume everything in its path. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the feeling of dread clinging to him like a shroud. Alex tried to rationalize these events, to attribute them to stress or lack of sleep. But deep down he knew that something was amiss. Black Hollow was awakening and he was caught in its grip. Alex's curiosity about Mr. Voss grew with each passing day, fueled by his unsettling encounters and the townspeople's veiled warnings. He began to watch his neighbour, his journalist instincts kicking in, trying to piece together the puzzle that was Mr. Voss. He noticed that Voss kept odd hours, disappearing for days on end, only to reappear without explanation. He seemed to have an aversion to sunlight, always keeping to the shadows, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He caught glimpses of strange symbols tattooed on Voss's arms, ancient runes that seemed to writhe and shift when he moved. The more Alex observed, the more convinced he became that Mr. Voss was not who he seemed to be. There was something otherworldly about him, something ancient and powerful that lurked beneath his human facade. Alex's gut told him that Voss was the key to unraveling the mysteries of Black Hollow. He just had to find a way to get close enough to him without becoming another victim of the town's dark secret. One morning, a piercing scream shattered the eerie calm of Black Hollow. A child had gone missing, vanished from her bed overnight, leaving behind only a trace of fear and the lingering scent of sulphur. Panic gripped the town, a stark contrast to the usual apathy that hung over the residents. But even in their fear, there was a strange reluctance to involve the outside world, a sense of resignation that bordered on acceptance. They spoke in hushed tones of the curse, their eyes darting nervously towards the woods that bordered the town. Alex watched the unfolding drama with a growing sense of dread. The townspeople's reaction, their fear mixed with a strange acceptance, chilled him to the bone. It was as if they had always known this would happen, as if they were resigned to their fate. He couldn't shake the feeling that this disappearance was connected to the darkness that permeated Black Hollow, to the ancient evil that the townspeople whispered about, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that Mr. Voss was somehow involved. Driven by a need to understand, Alex sought refuge in the dusty shelves of the town's abandoned library. Amidst the cobwebs and decaying volumes, he unearthed a collection of local lore, a chronicle of Black Hollow's dark history. The leather-bound journal spoke of a vampire lord, a creature of immense power who had ruled the town centuries ago. According to the journal, the vampire had been a benevolent ruler at first, protecting the townspeople from harm, but his thirst for blood eventually corrupted him, turning him into a monster who preyed on those he had sworn to protect. The townspeople, desperate to break free from his tyranny, rose up against the vampire lord, eventually managing to trap him within the bowels of the earth. But his hold over Black Hollow remained, a curse that would plague the town for generations to come. The journal spoke of a ritual, a sacrifice that must be made every century to appease the vampire lord and keep him from rising again. A sacrifice of innocent blood, the missing child, the townspeople's fear, the whispers of a curse. It all made sense now. Alex's blood ran cold as he realized the horrifying truth. The curse of Black Hollow was real. As darkness descended upon Black Hollow, casting long, eerie shadows across the deserted streets, Alex decided to confront Mr. Voss. Armed with the knowledge gleaned from the old journal, he approached his neighbour's house, his heart pounding in his chest. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the stillness like a death knell. A moment passed, filled only with the sound of his own ragged breathing, before the door creaked open, revealing Mr. Voss. His neighbour was dressed in a black velvet robe, his pale face even more gaunt in the dim light. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes, seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his lips. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Munro," Voss said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent shivers down Alex's spine. "Not after dark." Alex's hand trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the old journal. "I know what you are, Mr. Voss," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know about the curse." Voss's smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp, a little too long. Mr. Voss chuckled, a low, menacing sound that seemed to reverberate through Alex's very bones. "Curious, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth as silk. "How curiosity can lead one down the most unexpected paths." He stepped aside, gesturing for Alex to enter. The interior of the house was dark and oppressive, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by a single flickering candle on a heavy oak table. As Alex stepped inside, his gaze was drawn to a painting on the wall, a portrait of a man who bore a striking resemblance to Mr. Voss. The man in the painting was dressed in the finery of a bygone era, his eyes, those same piercing blue eyes, staring out from the canvas with an arrogance that bordered on cruelty. "He doesn't look too happy to see you," Mr. Voss said, his voice laced with amusement. But then again, he was never one for uninvited guests. Suddenly a blood-curdling scream ripped through the silence, coming from somewhere deep within the bowels of the house. Alex spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Voss simply smiled, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. "It seems we have a bit of a situation, Mr. Munro," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "Why don't you come with me? I believe it's time I introduced you to the true history of Black Hollow." As Alex followed Mr. Voss down the dark, narrow staircase, he knew, with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, that he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. The darkness had teeth, and it was about to sink them into him. At the bottom of the stairs, in a dimly lit chamber, Alex saw her, the missing child. She was lying on a stone altar, her eyes wide with terror, her body pale and lifeless, and standing over her, his back to Alex, was Mr. Voss. As Mr. Voss turned, a cruel smile spread across his face, revealing two elongated fangs. His eyes, once a piercing blue, now glowed with a malevolent red light. There, in the darkness of that ancient chamber, Alex came face to face with the truth. Mr. Voss was not just a recluse, he was the vampire lord. And he had just claimed another victim.